And we're live. Hello and welcome to the 107th episode of Hex Therapy Live. I'm your host, Maddie ALLin. Today we have special guest, Dr. Aubrey DeGray. Welcome.
Hey there. Thank you for having me back.
My pleasure. So I know that there are people who are watching the channel who are really excited to hear about what types of things you're doing to move the longevity space forward. But for those who are joining maybe for the first time, can you share a little bit about your background?
Sure, totally. So I started my life as a computer scientist, but since the age of about 31, 32, I switched fields to the biology of aging. And my focus has been to figure out how to do something about aging, how to keep people biologically young as they get chronologically old. And about 5 years in, around the year 2000, I made a bit of a breakthrough. I had a bit of a eureka moment that had ended up being a big paradigm shift for the field, essentially the realization that the right way to do this, to postpone the health problems of late life, is to repair periodically the various types of molecular and cellular damage that the body does to itself in the course of its normal operation. It was already very much understood that this damage is what aging is, that basically it accumulates over time and the body is set up to tolerate a certain amount of it, and eventually the amount of damage exceeds that threshold and you end up going downhill in terms of both physiological and cognitive function. But the paradigm before I came along was essentially that the right way to deal with this would be to slow down the rate at which that damage is generated. So essentially to make the body run more cleanly. And I came along and said, well, actually, you know what? It might be easier to let the damage be created, but to repair it every so often. And this has become a pretty much mainstream paradigm now. But that was basically between maybe 22 years ago and 15 years ago that I was putting out all of these scientific ideas and getting them understood and so on. Since then, I have done two things. Some of my time has been spent overseeing the scientific implementation of this in a sequence of organizations. And the other part of my time has been spent doing advocacy, getting the world to understand this, not just scientists in the field, but the general public, and not just the general public, but also, of course, people who have the capacity to contribute to this field significantly, whether it be financially or in terms of changes to policy, or whether it be changes to advocacy of all sorts. And it's been very important to do that, because at the end of the day, what I want to do is save lives. I want to make sure that these therapies are not only developed, but also made accessible to everybody. And it takes the world to understand the value of this in order for that to happen.
Well, I think there are plenty of us in the Hex community who can relate to the time when you discovered that cellular aging can be repaired, and then not everybody believed you, and then eventually it became mainstream. I think a lot of people today in the crypto world, maybe they've heard of Hex and it doesn't fit into their mainstream narrative, and so there's I think good things sometimes take time, and I agree with you that the advocacy part is it's really important. Once you find something you believe in, then you got to get the word out.
Sure. I feel a great deal of, well, let's call it temperamental affinity with the crypto world in this way. Of course, the concept of, a heretic coming along and actually being right and, changing the paradigm, that's not a new concept at all. This is something that's happened throughout the history of technology and the history of science. And it's the way things have always been. But the thing about the crypto world, of course, is that it's so young, and there are so many really good ideas out there, which are in a sense competing, but also synergizing. You know, there are ways to combine them in good ways too. And you know, the way to the ability of people to evaluate these ideas is extremely, you know, evolving. You know, so yes, I absolutely, you know, when I speak to people in the crypto community, especially in the Hex community, you know, it's not surprising to me that there is a lot of meeting of minds.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Well put. Yeah. Yeah. I think, so I want to hear more about what kinds of progress is being made with aging, and maybe at some point we can tie back in some points about human behavior and kind of how what it takes to be a more long-term thinking society, you could say.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, it's funny really, because people often ask me, you know, how long do you want to live? And my view is that's a really dumb question, because it's a question that you can always change your mind about over time. It's like asking, you know, what time do you want to go to the toilet on Christmas Day? You know, I mean, you don't have an opinion. You know, you might have an opinion about what time you expect to go to the toilet, because out of, you know, habit or whatever. But, you know, having an opinion about when you know, you're going to have better information on the topic nearer the time, right? So it's crazy. So I don't really think of myself as a long-term thinker, except insofar as I look at how things are likely to be in the distant future, you know, by default, and what I might be able to do about it. And of course, the biggest aspect of that is that I'm likely to get sick and eventually dead. I don't fancy that. So, so I've been doing something about that for quite a while. And that's essentially the same way that most people in the longevity community think about this. And of course, it's not just about oneself, it's also a humanitarian thing. And essentially, if one views things probabilistically, and of course, speaking to the crypto community, you know, I'm speaking to the choir here, we should be thinking that way, then anyone, you know, if they think about the individual contribution they might be able to make to their own probability of living a bit longer or whatever, it's tiny. It's absolutely tiny. I mean, even for someone like myself, who's been, you know, a leader in the field for a long time, you know, I might make a couple of % difference to my likelihood of getting to such and such an age. But if one thinks about humanity overall, you know, every single day that goes by, more than 100,000 people worldwide die of aging. And so if I can dedicate my life to this field, and the result is I postpone I hasten the defeat of aging by 1 day, you know, that's 30 World Trade Centers. That's like, you know, it's quite easy to get out of bed for that. And so
Yeah.
that's what motivates me.
It seems like there are people that get it and people who don't. What do you think it is about the people who don't get it that makes them different from the people who do get it?
So I've understood this thing for a long time. It's been very clear to me since the beginning of my time in this field that people who are extremely rational, totally rational about everything else, just very often just lose it completely when it comes to the concept of longevity. Of course, the most conspicuous example these days is Elon Musk, who goes out there quite often saying that he doesn't think that this would be a good idea, despite saying a whole bunch of other things that lead inescapably to the conclusion that it would be a good idea. You know, so I view this as, well, I've often called it the pro-aging trance. And essentially it comes from the fact that since the beginning of civilization, we have had to somehow come to terms with aging. We knew that we couldn't do anything about it. We knew that it was absolutely ghastly. And so we've just got to find some way to put it out of our minds, right? And we've been able to invent all of these tricks to, you know, deceive ourselves into the view that aging is some kind of blessing in disguise, when in fact it obviously isn't. And it's only recently, essentially since I came along really, that that we have any reason not to take that strategy, you know, instead to take the view that, you know what, we might make a significant difference to the time at which aging is defeated, whether we think about it in terms of ourselves or our loved ones or humanity in general. And therefore we need to get out of this pro-aging, you know, mindset.
Yeah, that makes sense. That people have to change their strategy once they don't once they're not in the same Stockholm syndrome situation with aging.
Exactly that. Stockholm syndrome is the right word to use. I've often looked at the literature around what's called terror management theory, which was developed quite some time ago, specifically in terms of figuring out how people, especially decision makers, could be more rational in the context of actual terrorists. The analogies are very, very close.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And is it sometimes hard for people to see the connection between like how this how do you explain to people the fact that this can help with all kinds of medical issues, but how this is better, how maybe contributing to the fight against longevity, or the fight for longevity, that
Yeah.
basically how see, that's the Stockholm syndrome speaking right there. In terms of donating to longevity research versus a specific ailment.
Right. So the default view that people tend to start with is, okay, there are these things called diseases that are potentially amenable to medical intervention. And some of those diseases predominantly affect people who were born a long time ago. So let's call those the age-related diseases. But the common view is that these things all happen within this kind of context that is called aging itself. And that thing is like, gravity. It's kind of completely like a phenomenon that we can't do anything about. It just is, it's woven into the fabric of the universe. And so in order to get people into understanding the reality, one has to go really deep into those fundamentals. One has to actually ask people to revisit that really basic assumption that aging is like gravity. If you do that, then on the one hand, it's easy because there is absolutely no reason to think that. There's absolutely no reason to think that. But on the other hand, it's really hard because people have grown up thinking that. Now, for whatever reason, I didn't grow up thinking that. I was just never told that aging is like gravity. It was always, to me, obviously a medical problem, a potentially tractable medical problem. But somehow this gets into people's minds, and once it's in, it's really hard to shift it.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, so I mean, and there's kind of this, it seems like people who are younger are more idealistic by nature, and then as people grow older, they kind of maybe succumb to more realism that would make it hard for people to dream about a future where aging is defeated. And it's certainly the case that that maybe people aren't just educated enough about the fact that that there are things that can be done at the cellular level.
Yeah, I don't like these ism words very much. Realism has this kind of air of superiority about it, as if it's kind of correct by definition, and therefore people adopt it. Whereas, in fact, pessimists like to call themselves realists, and optimists tend to be viewed as over-optimists, and so on. So I don't like these words. I think that we all have to be pragmatists. We all have to be people who are willing to accept what we can't change and to know what we can change, but also to appreciate that there's a gray area between the two, which we might or might not be able to change. And if nobody tries, we'll never know.
I know it seems like there was a pretty big scandal in the medical research community whenever it was uncovered that some of the basic research documenting one of the mechanisms of Alzheimer's turned out, that research had been done fraudulently. And it seems like billions of dollars went in the wrong direction in terms of that research. Did I read the headlines correctly?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, certainly there was some work that seems to have been fraudulent. And certainly the respect that work seems to have unjustifiably attracted did lead to funding decisions. But the work on Alzheimer's is, the funding area Alzheimer's is enormous. So in the grand scheme of Alzheimer's research and development, I actually think that this was a bit of a drop in the ocean. It wasn't a huge thing. In fact, the specific area of research that seems to have been fraudulent, or is claimed to have been, was with regard to a molecule that I hadn't even heard of. And I'm reasonably well informed in this kind of area, right? So, we shouldn't really, overstate the significance of this. Fraud is always going to happen in science, as it happens in every single walk of life. And honestly, I think we can feel good about the fact that the overwhelming majority of scientists, despite being under enormous pressures, enormous temptations to distort or at least bias the presentation of their data, do not do so. We scientists are good people by and large.
And was it that kind of like plaques and tangles was the wrong direction? Because even if you fix that really doesn't.
So that's a completely different thing. So throughout the history of Alzheimer's research, certainly the past few decades, there has been an enormous diversity of schools of thought, of which the two major ones have been one called the amyloid hypothesis, that says that this protein called amyloid beta is the main, the thing that we really need to go after. And another school of thought that says, no, it's actually another type of protein that accumulates in aggregates inside neurons called tau. Okay. Then there are other schools of thought outside of that. It's a little bit like in quantum physics, where you've got the Copenhagen interpretation and you've got the multiverse interpretation, and outside that, there's like 1% of people who think something completely outside of either of those. It's very, very similar. But the point is, it became terribly religious. In fact, so religious that people made fun of it. They called the Baptists and the Taoists. Because beta amyloid protein, BAP, right, and Taoist. So it became a bit too religious. But that's kind of moved on in a different way. In the case of both amyloid and tau, there is now an increasing consensus, in fact, I would say it is a consensus at this point, that the big things that you can see down the microscope, the big clumps of these things, are not the main problem. The main problem is what I call oligomers, where you get a few copies of these proteins coming together, not enough that you could anywhere near see them down the microscope, but enough that they misbehave in other ways, like they interfere with the integrity of cell membranes, things like that. So that's a very important progression that has occurred within the Alzheimer's community, but it's absolutely nothing to do with this fraud thing.
Interesting. What are some ways to get people more interested in funding longevity? It seems kind of like a general health thing.
Well, let me answer
versus people funding like individual ailments.
Well, let me answer that question in the context of the HEX community, because the conversations that I've had initially, of course, with Richard Hart himself, when he volunteered at one of my conferences way back nearly 15 years ago, and more recently with the rest of the community, not least via your very active work in inviting me to Vegas in March and so on. That's really been an exemplar of what I've seen over the years. What I've seen over the years is that essentially, in order to think about aging as a medical problem, you need to think about it as an engineering problem. You need to step back from the idea that aging is a phenomenon of biology and understand that it's really a phenomenon of physics. It's something that applies equally to non-living machines like cars or airplanes, same as it does to living machines. And that's really where I'm coming from when I talk about damage repair, preventative maintenance. It's kind of self-evident to an engineer that that's how you get a car or an airplane to live 10 times longer than it was designed to live, right? Which is what we've got. You know, we've got 100-year-old cars that were designed to live 10 years, right? Whereas it's not remotely self-evident to biologists. They just don't think that way. They find it insanely difficult to think that way. So I guess really, you know, a huge part of how the crypto community and the hex community in particular have got, you know, attracted into this is that they get it. They just get it at once because they're geeks mostly, right? And I've seen this prior to Hex, prior to any kind of cryptocurrency. I saw this, I had this. I mean, it's a large part of why I came to Silicon Valley. The people who were providing both financial and other support to this mission from way back when I began tended to be people whose background was in IT or in physics or in maths. And of course, there's a lot of those in the Bay Area, right? So yeah, I mean, I feel that it was not a surprise to me that the crypto community embraced this idea rapidly. Of course, it was a massive and an incredible surprise that it happened in such a big way 18 months ago with the Hex community, especially, you know, with at Richard's instigation. And I can't thank Richard himself, of course, and the Hex community in general, you know, too much. I can't. You know, there are no words to describe how massive that was.
And interesting. So can you tell me a little bit about what motivated you to give millions of dollars towards this cause?
So for me, it was really easy. So what you're referring to, I better go into a little bit of the background for those who don't know, is that I started working in this field back in the mid-90s, started my first foundation, the Methuselah Foundation, together with the wonderful Dave Goebel, who still runs Methuselah, back in 2003. And then in 2009, we bifurcated it to create the Sense Research Foundation. My mother died in 2011, 2 years after Sense Research Foundation was created. And well, she wasn't all that old. She was 86, but she'd been in bad health, so we kind of knew it was coming. And so I had plenty of time to think about what to do with what I was going to inherit. And what I was going to inherit was quite a lot, because she had been very judicious with her own inheritance from her own father back in the 50s and 60s. And she had plowed basically everything into a couple of houses in upscale parts of central London. And I was her only child. So the result was I inherited, if we convert it to dollars, $16.5 million. And I decided that I wanted to donate most of it to my foundation to accelerate this work. And that's what happened. I donated $13 million. We had to engage in a whole bunch of acrobatics to make sure that it was tax-free. That would have been $2 million less otherwise, so that was worth it. But the result was that for the subsequent 5 years, so basically 2012 through 2016, we spent twice as much money on the defeat of aging as we could otherwise have done. This was in the days when there was no private sector interest in this, very, very little interest from high net worth individuals philanthropically. Really, Peter Thiel was the first, and there was only one other, Jason Hope, who came in early. And we were, really, the fact that other people, starting with Michael Graver from Germany, came in 2016, that's the only reason that Sense Research Foundation survived and thrived, because that money was running out. So yeah, I mean, what made me do it is your question. Well, I mean, by then I'd already made all the decisions, right? I already decided this is what I want to commit my life to. It's very obviously the world's most important problem. I seem to be making a contribution. The more contribution I can make, the better.
Very cool. And then, and so what are some ways that you're able to balance, like, how much money you have in the budget for a foundation versus, like, basically how do you ensure that you can deploy it quickly, but also efficiently?
So I have the luxury, well, the privilege of having been very prominent in this field for a long time, which means I have a huge network and a huge amount of influence. And it allows me to not only promote and grow and optimize the activity of my own organization, but also to help other organizations. I've always been focused on doing that. Some people call me the love all, serve all kind of person, right? So it's all about like finding the right connections, putting the right people together, and getting the whole movement to work well. There's such diversity, right? There's scientists, there's investors, there's donors, there's journalists, there's everybody, right? And I feel very proud of that aspect of what I've achieved. But if we come back to my own organization, what I focus on within the entity that I lead, I've always taken the view that I need to play to my own strengths and my own biggest strength. And I define this not only in terms of what I'm good at, but what other people are less good at, is that I guess I have a thick skin. I'm able to be a good heretic, a successful heretic. I actually gave a talk a few times called "How to Be a Successful Heretic." It's essentially all about, first of all, being diligent. Actually figuring out what people might be getting wrong, and then persuading people that one's new idea is correct. But once one has done that to some extent, one needs to move to the next idea that people still think is completely wrong. And so that's really been what I've been doing over all of these years. When Sense Research Foundation started out back in 2009, rejuvenation was really totally not a thing. I had come up with the idea that damage repair was the right way to go back in 2000. And I'd been talking about it within the academic community. And after a good deal of acrimony in the mid-2000s, I'd basically won the battle. But it was still very not mainstream in the wider world. It really only became acknowledged that this was the way to be thinking about aging about 4 years later than that, 2013, when a paper came out that became by far the most highly cited paper in the whole of the biology of aging this century, called The Hallmarks of Aging. But early on, rejuvenation was something that was really, I was at the tip of the spear, trying to open the doors for people to walk through, trying to take all the bullets myself and putting myself into a position where I could take those bullets. And these days, I'm in that same position. I've deliberately maintained that situation. So my new foundation, Longevity Escape Velocity Foundation, it has that name and that emphasis precisely because even though rejuvenation per se is now a mainstream concept that most of my colleagues in the community are perfectly comfortable with, nevertheless, what I view as the inescapable corollary of rejuvenation, namely the fact that we will bootstrap it into essentially indefinite lifespans really rather soon with high probability. That conclusion is still something that almost all of my colleagues run away from very fast. And I need to fix that because it needs to be taken seriously in order for the right level of priority to be given by society in general to the longevity movement.
Do you think one reason people aren't ready to think about living forever is because maybe their lives aren't perfect today?
So, of course, you're asking the questions that a psychologist would ask, right? And rightly so. I think that there are a huge number of reasons why a regular person today would not want to think about living forever or even living a really long time. And therefore, I spend an enormous amount of my time, and I've been looking back, I've been saying this for literally 20 years, that this is not about longevity. Longevity is a side effect of health. So what the right thing for people to be asking themselves is not, do I want to live X amount of years? The right thing for people to be asking themselves is, do I want to get sick anytime soon? And perhaps one small extension of that, do I predict, do I foresee any age that I might get to at which I would want to get sick, right? If one's answer to those questions are no, right? If one says, it's always going to be better to be healthy than to be sick, then it comes down to a question of, okay, if you're healthy, are you going to want to die anytime soon, right? And again, it's anytime soon. That's the critical operative word, right? It's insane to have an opinion about the distant future, about what your desires are going to be in the distant future, about whether you want to carry on living. The best you can possibly say is you're probably not going to want to get sick. And also, you're probably still going to enjoy sex, one or two really fundamental things. But really, the idea that you might change your mind about whether you want to die is an idiotic thing to have an opinion about.
Yeah, thinking of the distant future, people are really bad at that. People are really bad at predicting what mood they'll be in tomorrow. People are actually, research and some common sense also demonstrates that people are even bad at knowing what mood they're currently in. And so it definitely is an issue of awareness. And so that kind of brings up the point of, what are ways that we as a community of people who care about longevity and people who care about crypto, whatever it is, how can we find ways to allow people to have contact with success on this seemingly very long journey?
I think the answer really is the only answer is to take it one step at a time. Every little step that is made makes the journey seem less long. It still may seem long, but even how it seems, let alone how long it actually is, becomes incrementally shorter with every step that's taken. So a lot of it is, as you say, thinking like hexagons think, right? Thinking long term, but seeing the progress, and focusing on the progress. And of course there are going to be hiccups, just as there are ups and downs in crypto value, there are ups and downs. So obviously over the past year and a half, as the Hexa community is very aware of, I've had my own ups and downs, but I've blasted my way through them. And I've done so for everybody's benefit, for my own benefit, certainly, but for the benefit of the donors who trusted me with their money. And they still have every right to trust me with their money because I am delivering on that trust. And also for humanity in general, the impact that the coup at Sense Research Foundation has made is already being minimized by the efforts that I have made with the help of the Hexagon community and the Hexagon money to take things forward at this point into the new organization, LEV Foundation, but also in the interregnum over the intervening year, when I've been able to achieve a great deal. I guess that a lot of the people who are watching this show will have seen the announcement that I made, the first announcement of the new foundation at my conference in Dublin about 3 months ago. I'm sure you'll put the link to that in the show notes, just to make sure that everyone gets it. That's quite important because it was a fairly thorough outline of what the foundation is doing, starting out. But yeah, I have been focused on that. When you have achieved a certain degree of prominence in a field, especially if it's a humanitarian field like this, you feel the responsibility. You know that with great power comes great responsibility. And I have been probably working harder than ever over the past 18 months. And I've worked pretty damned hard before then, I'm telling you, but probably harder than ever to keep the momentum going. I'm certainly, at this point, I cannot say that we did not lose some time. I believe that the people who caused all of this carnage have an incalculable amount of blood on their hands in terms of the future lives that will be lost through the delay of the defeat of aging. And, that needs not to be forgotten. But the fact is, I've done pretty well, I feel, in minimizing that over the past 18 months. And for sure, I'm continuing to do so. I can talk a bit more about the details if you like.
Yeah, yeah, if you could kind of bring us up to speed as to like what the 27 million that was raised through the pulse chain sacrifice, like how has that contributed to the field?
Right.
And then like, you know, and where is that money maybe headed if it's not already been deployed?
So that money came in, as I'm sure everyone who was involved remembers, 17 months ago, July of 2021. And it came into Sense Research Foundation, and because Sense Research Foundation is a 501c3, it was converted to fiat currency, to US dollars immediately. So as you say, that ended up being $27.5 million. And I was kicked out of the foundation a month later by means that, well, I don't need to go into the details of because it's all public. The foundation has continued in operation, and the excellent scientists that I had over the years have been continuing with the excellent projects that I inspired over those years. So, you know, the money has been spent that remains in Sense Research Foundation has been spent reasonably well. Certainly, it's been spent better than it would have been if it had been donated to some more mainstream organization. But inevitably, the lack of scientific leadership at Sense Research Foundation is having an increasing impact. You know, it's publicly obvious that you know, there's more and more money being spent on administration, public expressions of what's being done, such as, for example, something that happened on Twitter Spaces last night, 24 hours ago. You know, it was very conspicuous, this particular thing, which was orchestrated by the organizers of a new coin called Tyrant. You know, it was very conspicuous that there were none of the scientists were there. It was, you know, it was pretty sad. So, you know, it's not looking good, but it's been a great deal better than nothing. It's getting more and more urgent to put that right. But in parallel with all of that, of course, there's been this lawsuit. Things started looking pretty bad early in 2022 in terms of the way that money was being spent, the way that the board were making decisions. As I outlined in my talk that I gave at the conference you organized in Vegas. And the result was that three of the biggest donors to the airdrop, who jointly donated 12 of the 27.5 million, decided that, you know, enough was enough, and they sued the foundation. Now, it's very, very hard. It's a really uphill legal battle to do anything once you have donated money to a nonprofit in the US. But the situation was so bad, you know, the situation was so unambiguous that the foundation chose to settle the lawsuit really quickly, like, well, quickly by the standards of lawsuits, so it took like 4 months, but end of July. Sorry?
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that was really fast. And, you know, that only happens when the defendant knows that they are totally, totally fucked, right? I mean, of course, I wasn't a plaintiff, so I am not, you know, the parties that were, the foundation prohibited the disclosure of the nature of the settlement. So there's a lot of reading between the lines that everybody, including me, has to do. But, you know, you don't get a settlement that fast unless the defendants know that they are just totally fucked. Of course, the plaintiffs are happy, and here I am with a new foundation. So, you know, I mean, let me be clear. You know, the whole like hit job against me all the lies that were spread that exploited the Me Too movement to try to hurt me. It was all orchestrated by one guy. This guy Jim O'Neill, who had managed to get himself installed as CEO of Sense Research Foundation. But at least he had a motive. He wanted to keep the job that he wasn't doing, that I was getting him removed from. But, he would never have been able to wreak a fraction of the carnage that he actually wreaked without being aided and abetted by most of the rest of the board, who had no motive. They weren't being paid as directors or anything. It was just pure spite and self-importance and greed. And 4 of those people are still holding hexagon money hostage. Lots of it. So, of course, since the lawsuit was so successful, we have to presume it was so successful, reading between the lines, other people who contributed to the airdrop are also reading between those same lines. And sure enough, new litigation is on its way. I'm not tipping SRF off in any way by saying this. They already know it. And, this time it's probably going to be rather more decisive. So, yeah, I mean, it's painful. I do not like to see money that was donated to me for research going to lawyers, but it's a hell of a lot better than going down the drain. And I emphasize, I'm not leading this. One of the things that really stiffened the resolve, so I gather, of the plaintiffs in this initial litigation was the insult from the foundation that I was somehow the puppeteer here, that these people were just being led by the nose by me, as if they were not making their own decisions. That did not go down well, shall we say. And sure enough, this time, the same is true. I'm the cheerleader, absolutely. I think it's entirely correct that these people should see justice. But I'm certainly not the leader of all of this. I mean, the key thing, of course, the reason why this all makes sense, why it was so easy for the magistrate who oversaw the settlement process to make the foundation see that this was like game over, is because of the actual evidence. The publicly available evidence makes perfectly clear that the core accusations that were made against me in August of last year by Laura Deming and Celine Hurlier were fabricated, not by them, but by the board of directors. That the central claim was that multiple women had come to the foundation with sexual allegations against me. And in fact, 0 people had done anything of the kind. They were fed that lie, and the board chose to let that lie stand and that was obviously, fraud. It was illegal. So, it was pretty straightforward, and it's going to carry on being straightforward.
Yeah, I did a deep dive through all the documentation and stuff like that that I saw was posted and seemed very extremely thorough, and that was the conclusion that I reached independently, is that that it was a fraudulent claim, and it against you, and it seemed like a huge power grab, and I didn't. It seemed like there would have to be a motive, and I just assumed that it was venture capitalists trying to throw a wrench into a certain type of innovation that might compete with whatever they have cooking. But of course, that's not very specific. But it just seemed like it seemed like people wouldn't, and I guess somebody like trying to keep their job, I guess that and just certain toxic cultures and stuff. Sometimes people, but the board seemed like not all of the best characters, so to speak.
All right, and so at LEV Foundation, of course, I have extremely learnt my lesson. I mean, the board, what happened with Sense Research Foundation, as I mentioned, it was created in 2009. 2009, I really knew nothing about how to run an organization, and I relied 100% on Mike Cope, who was the main co-founder. I mean, there are officially 5 co-founders, but he was really the only one other than me who, he and I built this organization together. And, yeah, he's a corporate type, but honestly, I mean, I don't want to say too much about Mike. He's in very poor health now. He's no longer a director. He's not my problem right now. I don't want to let a guy when he's down. But the fact is, I ended up, in a situation that he created by bringing in these board members. I'm not saying that I disagreed with it at the time, but the fact is they ended up, being wrong-uns, as they say in the UK, being people who did not have the longevity mission at heart to the extent that they should have done.
That's too bad. I'm sorry that that the people who
let me talk about how
showed up didn't.
Yeah, I mean, let me talk about the manner in which I've learned my lesson, because of course we all need to look to the future here. The goal is to hasten the release of aging, and that's in the future, and we want it to be soon. So what have I done?
Yeah,
I've created this new foundation. First of all, I have a board of directors, 6 directors who have, first of all, the the right range of skills, all the right range of skills. People who really, understand all the things that one needs to understand in order to run a successful nonprofit in the US. But there also are 2 things that they have in common, and they have these 2 things in spades. Number one, they are absolutely really longevity crusaders. They are people who want to dedicate their lives and have dedicated their lives historically in almost all cases anyway, for a long time to this mission. But here's the thing that's perhaps the most important in terms of learning my lesson. All of these people I handpicked because of their explicit and, not just words, but also actions, dedication to the concept of respect for donor intent. Essentially, that is what went wrong at Sense Research Foundation. The directors just had contempt for donor intent. They decided that they knew the right way to spend donors' money, and the fact that it was completely contrary to what donors actually wanted them to do, and the fact that they had used me as the rainmaker, was not important to them. These people who constitute the governance of LEV Foundation have the utmost track record as being the exact antithesis of that. These are people whom we can completely trust with our lives, never to disrespect donor intent.
Excellent. Yeah, that's perfect, because that gives a lot of hope. That you're that you didn't just walk away from the situation. You really stuck with it, doing very difficult things. So I definitely want to thank you for hanging in there, because the donors really admire that you stuck it out.
Well, thank you for thanking me, but that's not really how I see it. I see it as part of as the essence of being an actual leader, right? Leadership. About like 2007, somebody in Methuselah Foundation back then sent me on a leadership training course for a few days, and really the goal was to understand vocabulary, like what an organogram is, things like that. But a lot of it ended up being people talking about what the difference is between management and leadership. And the good news for me at that time was that I already understood everything that they were saying. In particular, one thing stuck in my mind, which was a very good phrase, which was that leadership is not a hierarchical concept. In other words, it's like, well, the way I like to say it is, management is about getting people to do what you want them to do, and leadership is about getting people to want to do what you want them to do. And so for me, it's just like that. You know, I look up to the people who look up to me. I think about my staff, my loyal, long-suffering staff at SRF, and also my staff at LEVF, who I've poached obviously from SRF. I look up to those people, because they don't get people walking up to them in the street and asking for their autograph, right? They're not known, but they work every bit as hard as me. They show me an example. And the Hexagon donors just the same.
Can you explain what the idea is behind reaching escape velocity?
Sure. So first of all, yes, the term itself, longevity escape velocity. This is a term that I coined, I'm going to say 19 years ago maybe. And it's all about the bootstrapping that can be achieved from rejuvenation. So rejuvenation simply means damage repair. It simply means the concept I introduced back in 2000 of eliminating the molecular and cellular changes that metabolism creates in the body over time as a side effect of its normal operation. Now, the thing about rejuvenation is that it's a multi-step thing. Multi-component thing. It's a divide and conquer approach. There are lots and lots of different types of damage. And the only reason that this is all feasible is because those various examples of damage can be classified into a manageable number of categories, which is the essence of sense. The 7 deadly things that I've spoken about. But here's the thing: even within those categories, some of the examples of damage are more difficult to repair than others, and there's a degree of additivity in this. So each type of damage, I often say we've got to be reasonably comprehensive about this, because any type of damage can kill you more or less on schedule on its own, however well we fix all the others. But there is a bunch of crosstalk between them and additivity. So essentially, it does make sense to think in terms of easy damage and difficult damage, right? So degrees of difficulty of how to develop the therapies that will actually repair the damage. And that means that at some time in the future, we're going to get it to a point where we can repair enough damage to push healthy lifespan, and therefore total lifespan, out by, let's say, 20 years, all right? So, of course, it depends how you define health, but let's suppose that we're talking about taking someone who's age 60, and they've got a certain amount of functionality, right? They maybe can't run as fast as they could when they were 30, but they're doing all right. And we give them a bunch of stuff such that when they're 80, they're in the same biological state, same physiological and cognitive function that they had when they were 60. That would be great, obviously, on its own. But here's the thing. When we get them there, we're going to have a problem, because of this business about the easy damage and the difficult damage. We'll be repairing the easy damage, and we don't just repair it once. We repair it, as often as necessary. So for practical purposes, we can say that this 80-year-old doesn't have any easy damage anymore. They only have difficult damage, right? But difficult damage has still accumulated over that time because the therapies don't repair it. And so by the age of 80, they've got enough damage to make them biologically 60, right? So then they're a bit screwed, because they're going to carry on accumulating the difficult damage, and eventually it's going to kill them, same as the total damage kills people 20 years earlier at this point, when we don't have the easy damage licked. All right, so that sounds bad, but then we've got to take into account the fact that in those 20 years, people like me will have carried on developing improvements to the therapies. We'll have been chipping away at the difficult damage. And we won't have fixed all of it 20 years later either, but we will have fixed some of it, which means that we can take those 80-year-olds and we will be able to rejuvenate them with state-of-the-art, rejuvenation 2.0, and get them out to, let's say, 100 years, 120 years or whatever, right? And so on, as often as we like. So I defined this term, longevity escape velocity. It's a very simple definition, though it sounds a bit complicated when you spell it out. It's simply the minimum rate at which scientists will need to improve the comprehensiveness of these damage repair therapies so that people who are at any point getting the state-of-the-art therapies will be staying one step ahead of the problem and will not be getting biologically older at all, even though they obviously are getting chronologically older. Now, this only becomes a thing once we've got that first generation therapies that get you the first 20 years. Because, you know, if you can extend longevity by 2 years, that's not enough time for people like me to make much progress, right? So you've got to get to some threshold, and I say 20 years, before that kicks in. But that's longevity escape velocity. And the good news is that it becomes easier over time, because the further we get along this iterative bootstrapping process, the less there is of damage that is still so ultra difficult that we still can't repair it. And therefore, the longer it's going to take for that damage to catch up with us and get to be enough to make us sick and then dead, right? So actually, this thing, longevity escape velocity, this minimum rate, goes down over time. It's not like the singularity where you're talking about, accelerating change. It's actually deceleration is good enough, as long as it's not too rapid, right? And so, yeah, so that's the concept. Now, what it means is that people, there's a high probability of people who are alive today, even people our age, actually getting there. I mean, of course, if you're my age, I'm 59, right? But luckily, I'm biologically a lot younger. I'm biologically still in my 40s. So, you know, I've got a chance. People in their 40s now, they've got a respectable chance, because I think we have a 50% chance of reaching longevity escape velocity within just 15 years from now, right? So, you know, that's a lot of people. A lot of people who are listening to this podcast will, have a good chance of making it, as far as according to my prediction. It's all prediction, but my prediction is better than yours because I'm an expert, right? And so it's speculative. I'm only saying probabilistically, but still, good chance. That's what longevity is. And the thing is that because it leads to these very large, in fact, indefinite numbers, when you ask how long are people likely to live, people who are born today or people who are 10 years old today or whatever, when it leads to these very, very large numbers, most people look at the number first. They look at the conclusion first, and they run away. They say, oh, this can't be true, it's science fiction, and they don't look at the logic that explains why it's actually not science fiction, why it's actually inescapable, right? An inescapable corollary of getting even 20 years of lifespan fairly soon, right? So, you know, it's no accident that out of all of the really big hitters in the longevity community, there's only one who is willing to speak seriously about longevity escape velocity, and that's Brian Kennedy. The reason it's not an accident is because he did his undergraduate degree in maths, and the rest of them are just biologists, you know, through and through, and they just really hate this. They think about the politics first. They think about how it sounds like science fiction. It's putting the field into disrepute and so on. So because I'm the tip of the spear kind of guy, I thought, you know what? I should bloody name my new foundation, LAV Foundation, because that is going to really make the statement that we still have a ways to go. Even though rejuvenation per se has become a pretty damn mainstream concept, we've still got to push people further along the logical path to the logical conclusion of that thinking.
I think there's so much opportunity for the marketing side, and I say marketing just as growing an organic idea. Hexicans don't pay for advertising because we're all so motivated to go out there and talk to people and get the word out. But there are some I guess there are some concepts from marketing that we learn from, because it is a war for people's attention these days. Like, you have to be entertaining or bring something of value. And so if you had to summarize maybe in just one statement what the unique benefit is of escape velocity and working on longevity.
Well, let me answer those two last questions separately. So the value of working on longevity at all is something that can be expressed in many ways, but perhaps the most powerful one is the economic way. The fact that even if we postpone the health problems of late life by a year, we get trillions of dollars of benefit to the US economy. And of course, this applies across the world. Even in the developing world, this is often forgotten, but there is no country in the world, for the past, I think it's 7 years now, 2015, it became true that no country in the world has an average lifespan lower than 50. So aging is the number one health problem everywhere, not just in the industrialized world. People have been plugging away for a long time trying to persuade policymakers across the world that actually, it would be economically worthwhile to do something about aging, even a little bit, right? And it's fallen on very deaf ears, not because people dispute the logic, but because people dispute the premise. In other words, people say, well, okay, yeah, sure, okay, we totally get that if we could postpone aging by a little bit, then we have this enormous economic benefit. But we know that aging is like gravity, and therefore it's not going to happen however much money we invest, therefore go away, right? And that has been an argument that has become increasingly impossible to sustain. And so, it's no accident that that my new foundation, the Levy Foundation, is putting significant funding into a lobbying organization in the US that is actually educating Congress in this matter. Because now's the time. We can educate elected representatives on this matter. So that's with regard to the incremental part. Then with regard to longevity escape velocity, I think the main thing is with regard to the way that people think about aging. If they think, okay, so we might postpone aging a little bit, well, we'll probably extend the nasty part of life, the sick span. Also, we'll just kind of be keeping people alive in a bad state of health. I don't want that, fuck that. So, they're not terribly enthused. Whereas once you get into the understanding of what this really means, this indefinite postponement of that nasty part of life, so you never get there, right? The only thing that kills you is being hit by a truck or an asteroid or whatever. Then it becomes an altogether different, differently attractive proposition. And that's why I think that the concept of LEV needs to be sold properly.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've been trying to wrap my head around and study is the behavior of people when they time lock crypto, because it just strikes me as something that's so unlikely and something that just is kind of remarkable and unique. I think and it's weird how it's really how Hex has not been accepted in along with other cryptos. So there's something about it that makes it really different. And from a lot of people, insiders' perspectives, to me, the way I summarize why Hex is such a cool long-term play and why it's different than other cryptocurrencies is like, once Bitcoin had proven that you can have digital scarcity, you can have programmable money, let's say, it turned out that the best thing you could have programmed into Bitcoin was a time locking feature, because of the extreme volatility and price appreciation. Bitcoin went from a penny to $69,000 and then down again. And throughout that time, there were many dips that were 70%, 90%. All along the way, it seemed like Bitcoin would drop like 10x and then go up 10x, drop 10x, which is down 90%. Is another way of looking at it. But so I think that this idea and it actually turns out, a lot of people don't realize that Bitcoin actually does have a time locking feature built into it. It was just never popularized. So Hex is really the first crypto that programmed in HODL, of course, which stands for hold on for dear life. And that's because human emotions cause people to buy high and sell low, instead of the opposite, which is how people can save better for the future and make you know, better
You're saying it so well.
have better financial behavior.
You're saying it so well. I mean, it's all a matter of character. It's a matter of like, you know, what do you actually want, and how much are you willing to stick to the principle of what you inherently know you want, rather than, you know, take the easy route, the easy short-term route. Right? It's so much of that. I've had that the same way, you know, with this whole thing that I've had to endure over the past couple of years, right? There's no question there are people I used to think highly of that have really disappointed me. But there are not very many of those people. And there are just as many people who've gone the opposite direction, you know, who I didn't have particular. I mean, you're an example of someone I didn't know at all, right? And you've fought really hard for this mission, you know, and you've made a big difference. And there are other people who you know, maybe I knew already, but they didn't have a particularly, you know, central role in my crusade. And they have a much more central role now. And the reason they have it, just like you, is because of character. It's because, you know, they say that when the going gets tough, the tough get going, right? You know, I'm sure as hell tough, and I've got going, and there are other people. The people around me now, you know, by virtue of what happened, the people I have now around me have been like purified. It's been purifying selection, as one says in biology, right? I've got people around me who are, you know, the best to actually be warriors, because we're in a war, right? This is a war on aging, right? And you know, the sooner we fix it, the better. The sooner we win that war, the better. I need proper warriors, and now I have them better than I've ever had before.
One of the I guess one of the heretic ideas you could say that I've had consistently now for so many years is that there have got to be ways to program mental health into money. If you have programmable money, you know, contingency management, that's more effective than psychotherapy for a lot of things. But it you know, even contingency management never really got you know, it really doesn't get used. It's a tool that's just there, and it's not being used.
That's true. That's true. And honestly, this is an area where, you know, I've always been very, and I think one of the things that has helped me in very good stead in my work is knowing what I'm not good at. So I've always known that I'm, you know, a bit aspy, you know, a bit like, you know, not terribly good at reading between lines and so on. And so and also I don't understand money really, you know, I don't understand psychology. So what Richard's done, you know, with Hex and going forward with Pulse Chain, is just like, you know, to me, it's like magic. Like, I do not understand it at all. But it's perfectly clear that Richard is one of the best people in the world at understanding the psychology around this. And that's why Hex has done so well. It's why Pulse Chain is going to do so well. One of the people I've admired and, you know, publicly admired for many, many years is Peter Diamandis, who I would put in the same bracket there. You know, someone who combines vision with salesmanship, and that means psychology, right? To an unbelievably rare degree. So, you know, that, you know, I have nothing, you know, but admiration for Richard and what he's been able to do. I think, like, at the end of the day, though, what I do, therefore, is I act as the resource, you know, the person who has the skills to figure out how to make use of of what comes to me, you know, from people who on the one hand have that skill, and on the other hand who see the skills that I have. So at LEV Foundation, you know, it's very important for me to say what we're doing. I got out there in September when I did I feel like the soft launch before we even had a name that we could announce.
It's a great name, by the way.
Well, thank you. I believe it is for a whole bunch of reasons, but mostly because it epitomizes what I want to get to. You know, it was my goal, and you know, at the end of the day, this is my vehicle, right? So the question is, what are we doing? All right. So, of course, in September, I could, it was still very much a work in progress. It very much still is, but the progress has been very substantial in the subsequent 3 months. And I want to say that in 2 ways. First of all, I want to say we have an end of year fundraising campaign, like every public charity has, and I'm really, really, humbled and overjoyed to say that it's going extremely well. We've already brought in north of $1.6 million from erstwhile Sense Research Foundation donors who understand that it's ultimately all about me. And some of those donors, we're talking multiple 6-digit donations, right?
Wow, that's awesome.
Some of them from long-standing SRF donors, some of them from airdrop newbies, if you like. But the point is, this is going to make a very big difference to what we can do and how fast we can do it. And the more the better. So obviously, enormous thanks to those people. But we do have a donate page at avf.org, and of course, anyone can contact us. But so the question is, what are we doing with that money? So I already mentioned a little bit about how I completely agree with you that advocacy and changing the conversation is important. We're putting some money into that. But just as at Sense Research Foundation, most of the money is going into research. And we have one very much flagship project going out of the gate, which is combining rejuvenation therapies. This is extraordinarily important, both scientifically and rhetorically, in other words, in terms of changing the conversation. It's all about taking rejuvenation seriously as a divide and conquer concept where we have to repair a bunch of different types of damage. And the reason why it makes sense for LEV Foundation to be doing it and to be really, putting it front and center is because it is not well aligned with other people's incentive structure. In general, in the private sector, you've got, everyone wants to make money quickly, and they want to make a lot of money, and so they tend to be focused on their own IP, and combining things unless there's already really, really, incontrovertible evidence that the combination is going to be much more than the sum of its parts. It's just not going to happen. And similarly in academia, just sticking two things together that already have some benefit and showing they have more benefit, that doesn't get you a paper in Science or Nature or Cell, and that's not what people want. So, and yet it's absolutely fundamental to the rejuvenation concept. So it really falls to the philanthropic sector, and that basically means us. At Sense Research Foundation, I was thinking this way for a while, obviously, and I got a project going. But because of the lack of scientific leadership, it's going far, far too slowly and, conservatively. And so we're doing it properly. We're heading off. I bought 1,000 mice 3 weeks ago. And, those mice are going to be used for a very sophisticated combinatorial study of 4 very different interventions, each of them some kind of rejuvenation, and it's all going to be starting when the mice are already in middle age, so 18 months old, normally with a remaining lifespan of about a year and a bit. And the goal is to reach what I have for a long time called robust mouse rejuvenation. This is basically extending that by more than an additional year. So getting them to live more than 2 years rather than more than 1 year from the point that we start. We do not have any idea whether our initial 1,000 mice are going to deliver that. Of course, there's controls and everything, right? But this is a rolling research program. We will keep on going until we get there with different interventions and different combinations and so on. It's expensive. It's
these mice are older than the pulse chain sacrifice.
Pretty much the same age, actually.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, the mice will be reaching 18 months of age towards the end of January. So yes, pretty much exactly they were born around the pulse chain sacrifice. Thank you for pointing that out.
Wow.
Yeah, so but the point is here, we are doing things that are far more aggressive towards actually making proper progress than anyone else is doing. There are some other groups that are looking at combination interventions, at late onset interventions, but in general, they're being terribly cautious and only looking at, for example, things that can be provided in the chow, in the food of the mice, as drugs. We're looking at much more ambitious things, stem cells, gene therapies, and so on. Because we are very sure that we're going to need those in order to really, move the needle properly. And yeah, we're the only people doing it, and we're going to carry on doing it until we get to robust mass rejuvenation, which I still believe, like same as I did when I coined the term, I believe that it's what we need in order to get all, or at least most, of the credentialed experts, mainstream academic experts in the field, to be going out there and saying, yeah, you know what, we are within striking distance of bringing aging under proper medical control for human beings. Of course, translation of the exact same technology from mice to humans has a very low hit rate. We know that, but that's not the point. That's not the point. Some of it will have a hit rate, but the main thing here is the proof of concept. The fact that if you can take a mammal and you can do that much to it, even if you did nothing to it until it was already in middle age, then, the idea that aging is like gravity just goes away.
I kind of want to run through maybe like a 2 or 3 minute conceptualization of how I'm seeing these two kind of worlds of kind of bridging the gap between getting people interested in longevity and donating to it, and then getting the science done. I think that I agree with you that this is probably the world's most important problem, is just health in general. And the reason I think that is because health is something that's both physical and mental. And that's one thing I learned being a therapist for so long, is that when people are physically not feeling well, then mentally they're not feeling well either. And so there's this unbelievable amount of not prosperity, productivity, like health, it all goes together, that that aging is really holding us back. And so I think really the amount of funding that should be going to the world's most important problem, it's probably like trillions of dollars. And as a psychologist, like I and somebody who's interested in understanding macro financial behavior, I'm really kind of interested why humans haven't figured this out yet. As a group, there are those of us who have, and I kind of have a theory that is actually going to be probably put to the test here with the blockchain product that I'm releasing. But basically, the theory is that that it's basically that we're kind of subconsciously influenced by the monetary policy of our time. So for example, there is a pretty good argument people can make when they talk about like inflation is good for society in some ways. And but I really think that if there's too much inflation, and certainly in other countries, and it's something that leads to a lot of like instability in people's own kind of like relationship with the future. And so my my hypothesis is kind of that maybe when Hex came along and people started time locking their crypto, that maybe allows people to experience and contact a different relationship with the future than they would otherwise, right?
Yeah.
And we've seen like from like the beginning of Hex, like the first few days, the average time lock in the entire system was a little bit over 3 years. And then if we look at like how that has gone over time, I think right now we're at over 6.5 years is the average. If we go back a year, that's about we were 0.8 years. So, but basically in between the first and the second year, it was accelerating, and so it's really interesting to be able to see like the velocity at which this group of people is time locking.
I think you've really you've really hit the nail on the head there with that one phrase, relationship to the future. That is so important. I think that a huge amount of why it's been so difficult to get society behind the longevity mission is that the relationship to the future that the elderly have is really, or even the middle-aged people have, is really, messed up. They think about it as completely like I would say, like gravity, right? They think like, okay, their future is short and increasingly miserable, right? And if that's your attitude, then we can't complain if you're going to not be very interested in being particularly proactive, right? Whereas this, I mean, of course, you as a therapist, you've not just helped elderly people, you've helped younger people. Those people have very different problems that perhaps are more tractable, because the younger people have the capacity to be given more opportunities in their own as they see it, right? So basically, by turning chronologically older people into biologically younger people, from a psychological perspective, from a therapist perspective, or from a psychological perspective generally, we kind of convert them that way as well. They have a different kind of future, because people don't think about it. I mean, people, the craziest aspect to me of having an opinion about how long one wants to live is that it is synonymous with forming one's opinions about how much longer one wants to live on the basis of how long ago one was born, right? Which is like that makes exactly no sense, right? It makes exactly no sense. The only reason it makes sense today is because there is an actual correlation between how long ago one was born and how long one is likely to live, right? But when that correlation goes away, it actually goes away, right? So it's like, I mean, of course, I'm speaking as someone who is a recreational mathematician. And so to me, it's completely bleeding obvious that makes no sense whatsoever. But most people, I guess, they don't have that kind of way of addressing numbers.
They haven't had their aha moment yet.
I guess that's a good way of saying it.
So basically the blockchain product that I'm going to be coming out with soon is it's not a coin at all. It's a utility that allows people to time lock any cryptocurrency on the Ethereum or Pulse chain network. And the name is Time Pays Me. Time Pays Me is it allows users to lock up any crypto that's on Ethereum or Pulse chain for, I think I'm going to make the upper limit 55 years. And but people can lock as short as a week. And then once you time lock, basically you get to withdraw a certain amount every week based on how much time you've served. And so, basically if you time lock for a year and you wait a week, it's been about 2% of a year, and then so on and so forth, like for 10 years and whatnot. So
yeah.
It's pretty simple, but I'm hoping that it will catch people by surprise, because I'm one of only about 150,000 people in the world who's ever experienced what it's like to send money to your future self. And I know that I care a lot more about longevity than I did in the past, because I changed my relationship with my future self. And
And I
so one
guess,
thing that I
sorry, I was going to say, sorry to interrupt, but of course, I didn't know anything about Hex when Richard came to us a year and a half ago and suggested the airdrop. And I'm definitely still pretty ignorant about it. But I really want to say that this whole concept of time locking is so, like, it's one of those things, it's one of those ideas that, like, people look back 10, 20, 30 years later and they'll say, how did it take so long for people to think of that? Right?
Mm,
It's like, I mean, I'm hoping that people, well, to some extent, people already are looking at my idea of dealing with aging with damage repair in that same way. But it's up there, it's up there with those ideas that, like, once they're out there, you just kind of get them. And so I think it's interesting that, that concept of time locking is still struggling in the more mainstream crypto community to really get traction, and that Hex is still seen as a bit of an outlier. Of course, other cryptocurrencies, they all have their own, somehow they have their own idea behind them, at least the major ones, and so they're all different from each other in some way. But I think it would be correct, at least from my understanding, to describe Hex as quite an outlier. And the sooner that changes, the better, because clearly, the idea of time locking is so fundamental. Presumably,
I think that it's such a giant leap for people to get into Hex, because they have to believe, they have to understand where the APY comes from, which seems scammy to people at face value. And so that's why I hope that Time Pays Me allows people to have contact with this idea of time locking first, which is already scary enough to most people. And then then they'll still be able to see that Hex has attractive qualities about it that I'm intentionally not building in to Time Pays Me. So somebody could come along and they could prove how much they love Ethereum because they can time lock it for 50 years.
So I'm not sure I should be saying this publicly, but I'll say it anyway. My first reaction to the name is you should probably call it Time Pays Back or something like that, because it otherwise sounds like Time Pays Matty ALLin, which is probably right. Especially, I mean, because you're going to be the one out there, selling it, right? So I think maybe Time Pays Back would be better.
I already have like a few of the domains like Time Pays.
I imagine
just
you can probably do a few more domain names.
But yeah, basically, the reason why I put me in there is because it's a form of self custody.
Oh, I get that. I mean, it's not exactly new. There's 23andMe and so on. Yes, I understand that. I'm just like a little nervous about looking at you going out there and selling this and having it be a little bit too subliminally misunderstood.
That's that's really good feedback. So I think so I'm kind of on this quest to see if I'm right, that if people time lock, it can change their behavior in positive ways by improving their relationship with their future self. Now, one of the things that I would love to see, like the longevity field come up with, and maybe you're the best person to do something like this, would be to make like a feedback loop between funding longevity and having kind of a measure of how close we are to escaping.
So that's a great idea. That's a great idea. And actually, let me fold that into another thing that I wanted to make sure I brought up during this podcast, which is the work that we're doing on cryonics. So I mentioned earlier, of course, that our flagship project is this rejuvenation thing. We're trying to figure out how to keep mice alive for a long time as a way to keep humans alive for a long time. But however soon we succeed, there will still be a cohort of the population that are too old to make it, but who are only slightly too old to make it. And those people will, as various people have said, be the unluckiest generation ever. So question is, can we help? And of course, cryonics is the answer to this. Cryonics being the process of taking someone who has just been declared legally dead and taking them down to liquid nitrogen temperatures or nearby, and thereby preventing them from decaying. So the difficulty that this is an idea that's been around for more than 50 years, and it is embraced by a small number of people. But the only reason the only reason it's only embraced by a small number of people is because the goal is that you would revive those people in the context of improved medicine that will exist in the future, and you'll be able to fix what they, quote, died of, because they didn't really die. Because legally, we have this concept that someone's either alive or dead and not somewhere in between, but that is a convenient oversimplification of the biological reality. Namely that, that death is a process that happens over time. And so the idea is we would be able to, revive people. The problem is that the process of cryopreserving them, of taking them down to liquid nitrogen temperature in the first place, creates additional damage to the tissue, to the body, over and above the damage that caused them to be declared legally dead in the first place. And therefore, if we can reduce that damage, that additional damage, we are making the whole idea of cryonics much more feasible. Realistically, anyone who was cryopreserved before the year 2000, there's no way in the world they'll ever be woken up by just warming them up. The only hope for them is quasi-revival by uploading, by slicing and scanning their brains and figuring out what their personality was. And some people think that's okay, and a lot of people don't. In the past 20, 25 years, it's been a bit different because there's been a new thing called vitrification, which has very, very greatly reduced the amount of damage that is done during the cryopreservation process. So that now it's kind of, it's kind of touch and go. Probably most people who have been cryopreserved, even with vitrification, will never be capable of being revived by just warming them up. But there is research that's out there that can take a whole another leap in terms of reducing the amount of damage done by the cryopreservation process. So much so that, in fact, we could get it down to the point where it's negligible compared to the damage that we have to repair anyway with future medicine that caused them to be declared legally dead. And that's work that we are funding at LEV Foundation. So the reason I wanted to bring that up now is because it is the ultimate case of, investing in your future, of paying forward. Right. This is a case where you are absolutely, and the reason why cryonics, why people are able to sign up, people of modest means, is because it's paid for by life insurance. Because legally dead means a life insurer can pay out, and they know they're never going to have to, claw the money back when you get revived because you were legally dead. So It's not a ridiculous thing to do to sign up. Even now, I've been signed up with Alcor, the major cryonics provider in Arizona, for 20 years. I am really, really strong on this. I believe that we are in a position today where the whole rejuvenation idea is, it has real critical mass. It's got momentum. It still needs further work, which is why I'm doing the project on combination therapies that I mentioned earlier. But cryonics is a fair number of years, a fair way behind rejuvenation, and that needs to be fixed. So that's why LEV Foundation is putting proper money into cryonics, and anyone who understands the concept of, donating to your future, I think that's the phrase you use, something like that. This is the ultimate case of that. I believe that donating to cryonics research that can improve the possibility that you will be revived in the future, even if my rejuvenation work and other people's rejuvenation work does not keep your heart beating in the meantime. That is the most critical way of paying for your future.
I think like another really cool way to really like gamify the whole like involvement with longevity research. Like here's just some random examples I thought of, because I've been thinking about this for a super long time, but I'm kind of just starting to reach some maybe good ideas. Like how cool would it be if, if I'm donating to longevity research, and then there's something I can there's some statistic I can check up on, like how old is the mouse that like I helped pay for?
I love that.
Is it getting older?
So this is another enormous advantage of being an independent, philanthropically funded outfit that LEV Foundation is. If you're doing a big lifespan experiment like we're initiating right now, and you're in a company, you want the results to be private. You want to be able to make the most use of it. It's just as bad if you're in academia. You don't want but you want to get a high-profile publication. We don't have any of that. So what we're going to be doing from the beginning of the experiment, which at this point looks like it's going to be the end of January, we will have on our website, updated really frequently, probably once a week, something like that. We will have all the survival curves, we will all the data every fucking week. We will be absolutely going out there, making sure that everybody knows what things are looking like. And of course, interpretation of that data is, it's a scientific statistical issue, right? So as we get more and more data, we can interpret it. And we will be publishing our interpretations as well. But everyone else can do their own interpretations in the meantime. And we might even gamify it. We might just do that. We might just get people to bet on particular mice or whatever. I'm not sure I think that's a little frivolous, but that's just me. It might be the right thing to do.
Another kind of insight I could draw on would be that when I was helping people quit addictive substances like quitting heroin, opioids, alcohol, you name it, that it was really useful to give people hope, but not in a general sense, but in a sense where it's something that they could have contact with in the here and now, and it wasn't so distal. And so one example of that that actually got huge traction was me motivating clients to start taking omega-369. And the way that I pitched it was that 25% of the weight of your brain is supposed to be omega-369, and basically to just explain to regular everyday people, like to get them motivated to do something. It's like, if you're going to make these life-changing changes to your behavior, I need to at least be able to see immediately whether you're changing your behavior in this one really tiny way, which is like basically taking a supplement that's supposed to be already in your food. And by challenging people to do this one seemingly simple activity, it ended up leading to an incredibly unbelievable amount of change in people's lives, because I saw them take ownership of the idea that they're in charge of their prefrontal cortex, and that this is it just, the narrative fits so well to the actual science, and then what people would actually experience. I myself experienced, even without a background of suffering from addiction, I was still able to benefit from omega-369 and think more clearly and notice that it was me taking it that made the difference. And so it makes me curious, like if there was some challenge that people in the longevity space did, maybe it would make people stronger believers and stronger actors in the behavior of donating to longevity research. So for example, if I have some way to like, you know, do a skin treatment, like put some lotion on my face, you know, each day, that's an action that's going to reinforce my belief that like that I can do something today to look, you know, to look and feel younger and to improve
Yeah,
my
I think
self-care.
I think you're completely right, Matty, on this. I think that people often make the mistake of drawing a hard line between the research that leads to future therapies as against the things we can do already that some people do and some people don't do. A lot of this comes down to who's the specialist. The PhDs versus the MDs is more or less a good description of that.
Oh no, the connection dropped. So we'll wait and see if Aubrey's able to rejoin. It looks like maybe, I'm guessing either it was a power cord or maybe the internet itself that went down. But I'm really excited that Aubrey was able to come on for so long, and I'm really enjoying the conversation that we've been having. So shout out to everybody who's here in the chat. There we go.
Hey, so I have no idea what happened there. But anyway, as I was saying, so yes, so there's this kind of mindset difference between the PhDs and the MDs in terms of what they're interested in. But that does translate inappropriately, I completely agree with you, into a Chinese wall at the level of the audience. Some people get interested in what they can do today, and they kind of think, I'll worry about other stuff later. And some people are the other way around. They're interested in being, early adopters of things that haven't been proven and so on. So I agree with you completely. I think that we need to break that Chinese wall. We need to have more of a continuum where people understand that, that progress happens incrementally, and everyone has their own level of risk, comfort, risk aversion, and of course we see this at a global level in terms of the regulatory environment, the regulatory regime that exists in different countries. Some countries have a more restrictive one, some people have a more liberal one, and I feel that's a good thing, that people have that choice. But of course, it is only a choice if you have the resources to engage in medical tourism, to choose what country to work in. In the longer term, that's not an issue because countries compete with each other. And so, if a country feels it's being, out-competed because its regulatory regime is too conservative, then that will be an incentive to make it less conservative. But that's a much slower process.
It would be really cool if there was some like intergroup contingency, like okay, another drop in the connection. Looks like the Matrix is trying to make sure that we'll end up aging, but sure enough, we'll pull through with technology here. Are we back?
I'm back. I don't know how much of that you heard.
I heard everything that you said, and we just got cut off in maybe the past like 20 seconds.
Okay, very good. So we got as far as that's a slower process. All right, good.
So like one thing that would be really interesting would be if there was like some sort of like a intergroup contingency or competition that like let's say you were publishing a number each, maybe it was a continuous number, and like if I donate $1 million, I can actually move the velocity and I can see it in real time. But I don't have to donate $1 million. I could get 10 friends to all like take better care of their skin today, and then press a button, and then that moves, because we know that anything that people do to have more long-term thinking and to have longevity on their minds, to like prove that they believe in this moment that that this is something that we can win, then that reinforces that belief, and it makes the belief like more uh, kind of viral in a sense, if you can gamify it to the point where people really start taking ownership of every tiny little contribution that they can make.
Yeah, sure. I'm entirely open to these ideas. You know, I don't have the right
Cool.
experience to design those things, but I'm very open to people who do, like yourself.
Very cool. Well, I'm super excited to see what the future holds for the the collaboration between anybody who's working on longevity, anybody who's working on time locking, and having a better relationship with your future self.
Well, thank you. Before I forget, one thing I definitely need to announce, and this is, you heard it here first. You have the privilege of being the first person to hear it, and your audience, of course, is that our next conference in Dublin is now fixed. It will happen on August the 17th through 20th, so it's going to be a fair bit longer than the previous one. And back to the kind of length that I used to have in Cambridge in England. It will happen between the 17th and 20th of August in Dublin, same city that it happened last time, but this time it'll be in a different venue, a fantastic hotel that I had the privilege to look at recently, and it's the right place to have it. So put it in your diaries. We want it to be a really big event. It will be the first event of the season, so to speak, of conferences that happen in Europe during the second half of the year. And of course, the speakers will be absolutely stellar because I'll be choosing them. And not just the speakers, but the recreation, which is of course a very big part of the conferences that I run, and the audience in general will be very varied, diverse. Everyone will make new friends. So I very much encourage everybody to do that. We will be sorting out everything and putting registration up as soon as we can. But fix the date right now, 17th through 20th of August, 2023.
Awesome. And the online Hex conference is another chance where people will be able to hear you speak, and that'll be coming up on January 8th in the evening.
I'm really looking forward to that. I will have more information to give at that time on especially the mouse combination experiment, which will by that time be just about to start. We will have the mice at our wonderful partner iCore Therapeutics up in Syracuse, upstate New York, which are the go-to place for this kind of experiment. Everybody uses them, they're wonderful. And they are, in fact, also a spin-out from Sense Research Foundation, the most successful of those half dozen spin-outs. So I'll be able to talk a great deal about that at your event on January the 8th. I'm really looking forward to that.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here. And can you tell people again where to go so that they can donate to the Longevity Escape Philosophy Foundation?
I sure can. LEV Foundation, levf.org. We were very happy to get a nice, concise domain name, levf.org. The donate page is obvious. And of course, there's also information about all of our activities. The information is somewhat, concise right now, and we will be expanding it over time. But yep, that's the URL. And I will also send you, for the show notes, the URL of the YouTube video of my Dublin talk from 3 months ago, which contains a lot more information.
Awesome. Well, I'll put a link to that here. So, well, for now, Aubrey, I really appreciate you coming on. It's been an honor and a pleasure as always.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. All right. And now we'll go to the outro.
It's from Maddie ALLin of HexTherapy.live. I like Maddie. Maddie tries to make the world a healthier place. mental health professional. He's done research.
Big videos on sudden wealth syndrome.
There's nothing that a human being can do better than try and heal his fellow man.
Maddie Allen's got that covered. He does emotional, feel-good, mind management, emotion stuff, like, as his gig, because he's a therapist. That's what he does for a living. Like, he helps heal people.